All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today here in the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the University of Manitoba for a special seminar presentation today. And my name is Nazim Chichek. I'm the Associate Dean Research for the faculty. And just as a reminder, today's session is being recorded so we can post for future viewing. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba is located on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. With respect to treaties made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Okay, so today's seminar, entitled Regenerative Agriculture, Thinking Outside the Box, will be presented by our special guest, Mr. Tony McQuail. Just before I introduce Tony, I wanted to take a moment to put in a plug for the Manitoba Agriculture and Food Knowledge Exchange, our knowledge translation portal. You can find it at makemanitoba.ca. This website highlights our faculty's research as it relates to consumers and producers, with links to resources such as podcasts, infographics, fact sheets, even recipes. And you'll also find other seminar videos, such as our faculty conversation series and today's video. It'll be posted there shortly as well. And today's topic, as I mentioned, is about regenerative agriculture. It's a term that has captured the interest of many producers, researchers, and even the media and the general public. And we will be exploring the need to think outside the box when dealing with complex biological systems and processes. And our speaker will touch on the collateral benefits of carbon sequestration strategy based on shifting to regenerative agricultural systems. He will also explore the difference between optimizing such systems and their performance versus maximizing specific outputs. Okay, now let me introduce you to our speaker. Tony McQuail is an honors Bachelor of Environmental Studies from the University of Waterloo and is a certified educator with Holistic Management International. He was instrumental in founding the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario and the Collaborative Regional Alliance for Farmer Training. And Tony and his wife Fran operated the Meeting Place Organic Farm, a diversified organic farm near Lucknow, Ontario, where they raised livestock, managed a small apple orchard, and operated a community-supported garden. They've been using holistic management principles and tools for over 25 years, raising grass-fed and finished beef, pastured pork and poultry, and also experimented with cover crops. They have since transferred the farm operation to their daughter, Katrina, and I understand she has 2 little ones, and they continue to be actively involved with the farm. I'll also add that Tony has a long-standing interest in renewable energy, including wind power, live horsepower, solar heating, and photovoltaic systems. As a matter of fact, they annually produce more photovoltaic electricity from their solar arrays than their home and farm businesses consume. Without further ado, over to you, Tony.
Well, thank you, Nazim. And today I'm hoping to share some stuff that's affected my thinking and ideas through some stories. And I didn't grow up on a farm, but I did have 2 uncles who farmed, and I spent some time with them. But I really started my farming career as a hired hand on a dairy farm when I turned 18. And after several years, I felt I really liked farming. And in 1973, at the age of 21, I purchased what became Meeting Place Organic Farm. During that period, we lived through the energy crisis of the early 1970s. And survived the high interest rates that energy crisis helped create in the late 70s and early 80s. And we made the transition to organic farming in the mid 1970s. And then over the years developed a successful small farm that our daughter now operates. In 1995, we took a holistic management course, and it was transformative for us. Up to that point, in many ways, we felt like the farm was driving us, and we were working for the farm. But after taking that course, we learned how to manage the farm and our relationship to it so that it felt like it was working for us and our values and our family. And I suspect that if we hadn't taken that course, I'm not sure our daughter would have been interested in coming back to the farm. So for us, holistic management and our transition to organic farming were certainly two key elements of our farming journey. I've also worked off the farm at various off-farm jobs and also volunteered in a number of farm organizations. And I did serve as the executive assistant to the Ontario Minister of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs in the early 1980s and helped develop the environmental farm plan program that still exists in Ontario. And I'm currently on the board of Holistic Management Canada and on the governing body of an organization known as Farmers for Climate Solutions. So today I'm hoping to share some ideas and give you some challenges. I believe that regenerative agriculture is one of the best ways to address a number of problems we face as a society. If we look at it, we don't need new land. People talk about planting trees to deal with climate change. I'm not sure what planet they're going to find to plant those trees on. But we've already got land that we're farming. We need to manage that land that we have a bit differently. We don't need new technology. We can maybe invent some that will help us do regenerative agriculture better, but we don't need new technology. We already have it. And I believe that it's one of, if not the least costly, certainly one of the least costly ways to address climate change and a number of other problems. I'm not going to try and do an exhaustive discussion of regenerative agriculture. When I started farming and got interested in ecological agriculture, there was no internet. And the ag reps didn't know about it. And we formed the Ecological Farmers Association, so a few of us who were interested could share our mistakes and our successes. Now you've got a wealth of rabbit holes to go down, but I'll leave you some contacts or some links that you can use if you want to explore it further. But what I'm hoping to do is share with you why I think regenerative agriculture is important. And I have put together a slide set, and hopefully it's not going to be too long, and I'm going to successfully share my screen now. So there we are. So this is what we're doing. So I want to start with Joni Mitchell's chorus from her song Woodstock. We are stardust, we are golden, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. And to me, that's part of what we're doing when we talk about regenerative agriculture. I also want to share a couple of thoughts from one of our holistic management mentors, Don Campbell of Saskatchewan. And he says to make small changes, change the way you do things. But if you want to make big changes, change the way you see things. And I want to share a couple of things that changed the way I see things or saw things. Back in 10th grade, we did a fruit fly experiment. And I don't know if they're still doing that with 10th grade biology classes or not, but in day one, we had this jar of banana pulp and we put a male and a female fruit fly in it. And then every day we'd give them a bit of ether and shake out the flies and count the number of flies. And by day 26, there were over 100 fruit flies. Day 28, there were over 200. Day 30, there were about 500 fruit flies. But then on day 31, instead of that exponential curve carrying on and going up, there were only 50 flies left. And by day 32, there weren't any live fruit flies left. And the thing that really struck me about that experiment was that there was still banana pulp that could have served as food, but the fruit flies had poisoned their environment with their metabolic wastes. So I always think about that experiment when I see graphs like this that shows the human population on this wonderful exponential curve. And one of the things that strikes me about that is if we look at around the 1700s, where you have sort of the start of the Industrial Revolution, it's no longer our metabolic wastes that we're contributing to the system. We're now contributing our industrial wastes. And what we're looking at now, if the figures I pulled off the internet a couple of days ago, and we're not going to go through the specifics of the figures, you can look at them and maybe I screwed it up and got it all wrong in terms of what I multiplied by what. But it looks to me, if we use those figures, that we're now contributing 66 times more energy use and resource use than we do in terms of the metabolic energy if we look at the calories we would eat. How much more quickly can we poison our environment than those fruit flies? And I hate to think that as people we're dumber than fruit flies, but I'm sort of wondering that question as I look at those figures. But we'll carry on. So these are some more quotes from Don Campbell. Agriculture being the foundation of civilization. And, we've lost track of that as a society, particularly in North America. I think Europeans, having survived a couple of world wars and that, have a much greater appreciation of the importance of food. But in North America, we've been able to take it for granted for a long time. But there are past civilizations that have failed, and they failed because their agriculture failed. And, we need agriculture if we're going to have a society and a civilization. One of the things that I find particularly worrisome, those past 26 civilizations failed in specific regions. And when they failed, they didn't take everything else down with them. When you have a global society and a global economy, if the system fails, some people think they're going to fly away to other planets, but I think we have a remarkably lovely place to live here, and I don't think they're going to find a better one. No matter how much money you've made on Google or selling Teslas. So I think we better take care of what we've got. That's certainly where I put my time and energy. So that brings me to the next thing that happened, and this was when I was in environmental studies at Waterloo. I already had the farm, so I was focusing the coursework that I did around agriculture and around farming. And so one of the projects I looked at was the issue of net energy productivity of agriculture, or what now we might call the EROIEI, the energy return on energy invested. And there was a husband and wife team, the Steinharts, who had done a look at this. And they looked at what they called primitive agriculture and food systems, the pre-industrial ones. And the interesting thing to me was that they yielded between 5 calories for every calorie invested up to 50 calories. 5 calories was pretty much subsistence agriculture. 50 calories was some very intensively managed paddy rice, where you were growing rice, but you were also raising fish, and you had ducks, and a very complex thing, maybe edible greens on the paddy walkways and that sort of thing. But the important thing to recognize was that for every calorie put into the system, they got 5 to 50 calories out. And I wondered, well, why didn't they get a 4 to 1 or a 2 to 1? And I suspect that the reason that the minimum was the 5 to 1 is if you didn't have that kind of productivity, you starved out. You didn't have enough energy. You had to work continuously if you had a 1 to 1, right? You couldn't sleep, you couldn't raise the next generation. And you couldn't survive tough times. You couldn't survive a drought or a flood if you didn't have a big enough surplus. So my sense is, if we're going to have a sustainable agriculture, it has to have at least a 5 to 1 output. And to be regenerative, it has to meet some other criteria as well. And if we were there in person, and that I'd be asking you the question, okay, how many people that think that the modern industrial food system has 50 to 1? And so, how many think it has 100 to 1? But the disturbing aspect was, and we're not going to do that, is that the modern agriculture and food system, as Steinhardt studied it, yielded 1 for every 10 put in. So what we've really gotten good at as we've industrialized agriculture, and particularly in, I would say, the last 70 years, is at converting fossil fuel to food. And that may not have been a problem when we didn't appreciate the consequences of releasing all that sequestered carbon and sequestered energy that was taken out of the Earth ecosystem and put down as coal and petroleum and natural gas. But we're starting to recognize that that's maybe not such a good idea. It's also a very unproductive system if you're looking at energy, if you're looking at minimizing human labor, okay, maybe it's got some pluses, but if you're looking at trying to look at an energy balance, it's got some serious challenges. The other thing that I think it points out is that this is a chart of gross farm income and net farm income. Gross farm income is in the blue, net farm income is in the green. And if you look at starting about 1956, up until then, from 1926 to 1956, net farm income kind of followed the same curve as gross farm income. But as we became more and more energy and input intensive in agriculture and substituted those inputs for farm management and farm labor, net farm income falls way down, while gross farm income gets higher and higher. And this not only has implications for the farm, but it has huge implications for the rural community. And so I want to put that out there, because often we think that everything's progress, and well, progress is not always progress. And our substitution of fossil fuels for metabolic energy in the food system may not have been progress, and certainly for the rural community, the ever bigger and more energy intensive and input intensive agriculture may not have been very helpful. So I want to offer you a challenge. This is, after all, the agriculture and food sciences a webinar. Can we design production systems and a social economy where most of the energy required to make the system function is metabolic or food energy and comes from regeneratively produced food? Because to me, that's maybe where we need to get to if we're really going to have much of a future for my grandkids. So I just want to put that out there as a challenge to you. The other thing I wanted to, another thing, I'm going to cover a lot of stuff, and hopefully we'll have some time to deal with some questions, but this is a pie chart of the atmosphere, and it looks to me like there's a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere. So, why are farmers buying nitrogen? According, again, this is Google, I worked at, but several different sources said that above an acre of land, there's approximately 70 million pounds of atmospheric nitrogen. And with so much nitrogen above and around us, shouldn't we, instead of looking at burning energy to create nitrogen fertilizer, shouldn't we be designing agricultural systems that are structured to optimize their production by using biological systems to capture that nitrogen and make it available to plants? And also, in the process, can we then develop a balanced fertility for both our plants and animals that isn't just the NPK approach, but in fact ensures that all the different metabolic processes that plants and animals need to function well are met by the nutrients that the soil and the system are providing. So another challenge, can we design such a system? But what do I mean when I think about regenerative? Well, I think about things that are growing, that are alive, that are healthy, that are healing. But I also think it's important to think about things that are decomposing and cycling. It's not a concept our society is very good at. We want to have growth, growth, growth in the economy. In fact, if we don't have 3% growth, we think we're in a recession. So we're not very good at following cycles the way things tend to work in a natural ecosystem. And for many of us, this is a paradigm shift, because we've also been told in agriculture, get bigger or get out, keep getting bigger. And as an aside, to me, that's developed a form of agricultural cannibalism, where instead of looking at our neighbors as somebody to work with and have in the neighborhood, it's, well, are they going to fail so I can get their land? Not a healthy system for building a strong society or community. So to me, we need to do some paradigm shifting if we're going to really move in a regenerative direction. And I think in many ways that involves thinking about our economy. So this is a chart by one of my favorite economists, Hazel Henderson. And she said, I'm an economist, but I'm tired of pie charts. I want a cake chart. And she created this economic layer cake where she said the bottom layer is Mother Nature. The next layer is the love economy of the family, the neighborhood, the community, volunteers, coaching sports teams, all those different things, looking after each other. And then the third layer is the governmental layer, which is provides the infrastructure, provides many of the services that make a society work. And the final layer on top is the private sector. And her important point was that each layer depends on all the layers below it. And a very different way of thinking it, because if you listen to the news these days, you'd think that the Toronto Stock Exchange and the economy was the most important thing. So I always like that cake chart. I think it's a bit of a paradigm changer if you think it through. Another one is Kate Raworth's donut economics. interesting that two of my favorite economists are women who use nice baked goods as their sort of imagery for understanding the economy. But for Kate Raworth, she talks about her donut where the outer ring of the donut is the ecological ceiling that we better not go through or we're going to be in trouble. And the inner ring of her donut is the social foundation, which we better not fall below. And again, there's a lot of information in a graphic, but I find that graphics often communicate a lot more than, trying to, I hope it's worth 1,000 words and maybe quite a bit more. But I would recommend her book because it talks about first how economics got so divorced from the environment, from society, and even how economies truly function, and then talks about how we might adapt and change so that we have an economy that actually works towards social well-being or thriving, as opposed to just focused on growth, which I think is an important paradigm shift. Right now, we've got a cancerous economy in many ways, and it's not healthy for the body individual or the body collectively. So this is another image, which tends to be the way we sort of operate at the moment as a culture and society. Hierarchical, seeing the rest of the system falling down below us. And then if we think about it in a more ecological way, we see it as an interconnected web of life, which we're a part, in which we're interdependent. We're not standing outside it. What we do to the bacteria may come back to haunt us. And so it maybe takes the biblical injunction, what you do to the least of these, you do unto me. Well, that's something we might well reflect on as we look at our relationship to the ecosystem as well as our neighbors. So a couple of useful concepts from holistic management that I wanted to share in this talk is one of our testing questions when we look at decisions or consider things is, what's the root cause of the problem? What's the root issue? And I think in terms of climate change and regenerative agriculture, is the problem carbon dioxide, or is it too much energy use? Another question is, what's the marginal reaction? Where will we get the most bang for our buck or our labor? And when I listen to a lot of the discussion and a lot of the excitement and hype around climate change, there's a lot of unproven, expensive technological fixes that are being proposed. But to me, regenerative agriculture already has been proven by a lot of people who've been experimenting. It's cost effective. And if we do a redesign and use biological approaches, I suspect they're going to give a much better marginal reaction and also a much quicker return. And another final one I wanted to share was what we talk about, the weak link. And we talk about it as a financial weak link, a biological weak link, or a social weak link. And I think our weak link at this point in dealing with climate change is that we have a belief system that sees society's purpose as serving the economy, holds unlimited growth to be essential, and the ecosystem is an externality. So I think when we try and look at how do we address this problem, how do we solve it, we have to be prepared to think about and address those beliefs, because as long as that belief is steering the train's going to keep on the tracks that are taking it to a bridge that's no longer there. And I don't want to be on the train when it goes off the tracks, and I don't suspect most of you don't either. So, regenerative farming, agroecological systems come with many different names: ecological farming, regenerative farming, permaculture, organic farming, biodynamic farming, indigenous farming, holistic management. And, none of them maybe have all the answers, but they're people experimenting with ways. And I guess the key point is trying to figure out how to minimize inputs, how to work with nature, how to have a biological agriculture. And I think in many ways, agriculture has gone through some phases. I think pre-industrial agriculture was biological. We developed the plow, and then we got much more physical in terms of equipment, plows and cultivators. And, the McCormick Deering binder is just an amazing piece of equipment. But we got mechanical, then we got chemical when we started to look at fertilizers and then the pesticides. And I think we're looking at a resurgence and a return to a biological emphasis in agriculture, where we're starting to see the cost of some of the inputs and the chemical and physical power that we brought to agriculture, and are trying to reconnect with the biological. So I think an important thing for us to remember is we're mostly air and water synthesized through plants. I don't want to get rid of CO2 because I'm part of that cycle. So it's an important thing for us to recognize and remember as we go forward and struggle with these challenges and problems that we face as a society. So what I'm wanting you to do, and certainly what I try and do, is think inside the circle of life, which involves the water cycle, the mineral cycle, the flow of solar energy through the system, and then the biological communities that harvest that solar energy and share it and exchange it between each other. But I want us to think outside the box of modern economic assumptions, because I think they have steered us in remarkable ways in terms of stuff productivity, but I think in terms of long-term ecological success and that they are very problematic. And so I would challenge you to look at the assumptions that you hold about what's necessary for an economy to function and what's necessary for your future, and the economic assumptions that underpin that. Take a hard look at them, because that's why I think it's important to think outside the box, and it's in some ways what we've tried to do here at Meeting Place Organic Farm, and it turned out to, at least in our situation, work out pretty well. The weeds didn't take over. We didn't go bankrupt. In fact, we've had a pretty good life, and people enjoy coming to see the farm and visit the farm because it is full of life. So I would encourage you to connect with the circle of life, because I don't think economic assumptions are taking us where we need to go. So now, regenerative agriculture. Well, healthy soil underpins and supports regenerative agriculture. And this is an area that I think is bringing farmers together across what at times has been ideological divides, because for all of us, no matter what techniques you're using, if you're conventional, whatever that is, or if you're organic or you're regenerative or whatever, soil is important to all of us. We can't afford to lose it. We need to take care of it, and it's a unifying place in the farm community. So many of you will have heard of Gabe Brown. His book Dirt to Soil is a real testimony, and he follows the 5 principles. Limit disturbance. And of course, there's been a lot of talk about limiting plowing and cultivating and those things that disturb the microbial community of the soil. But he also talks about limit disturbance in terms of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, the herbicides, the fungicides, the insecticides, and those different ways of disturbing the natural soil biology. Then keep the soil covered, armor the soil surface. So that's where the green manure crops and crop residues and that the multi-species cover crops all come in. Build diversity either in your crop rotation or through multi-species cover crops if you're cash cropping, or greater diversity in your hay and pasture, adding various things, and quite possibly if there are areas that it's not easy to get into with the cultivator or with whatever equipment you're using, let those naturalize so that you have more habitat for pollinators and beneficial predatory and parasitic insects, and also birds and that. And then if possible, keep living roots in the soil, because we're learning a lot more than I learned when I took soil science back in the 1970s about the relationship between plant roots, plant root exudates, and the microbial biological community and the symbiotic relationships there. So living roots in the soil are pretty critical to keeping that soil community healthy and thriving. And then integrate animals. Ecosystems are a mixture of plants and animals. And in agriculture, if we can get animals back on the land, back out onto the land, that can have some powerful synergistic effects in terms of the plants and the soil. And finally, he added a 6th, which was understand your local context. And this is critically important if you're looking at making transitions or you're advising people on making transitions. And that is, what works in one area won't necessarily work in another. We've gotten kind of used to an agriculture that's sort of a recipe book, or one formula of how much fertilizer to put on, what to do here and there, was being promoted. But now it's really important to understand your local context. Is that a south-facing slope or a north-facing slope? What are the really critical things to keep in mind as you're trying to manage things in a more biological, ecological way? So I think this is an interesting slide. Those are our cattle in the summer and in the winter on the left. And on the right, you'll see the root depth of a grass perennial plant and the root depth of what I believe is a wheat crop there. And so if we're going to build soil and hold soil and move carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and into the soil, then figuring out ways to have perennial grasses on land, and to hopefully get the livestock back out on the land so that they're eating that, and also then fertilizing the land, saving a bunch of time, and also putting that fertility where it needs to be in a way that's much more effective in terms of the nutrients actually getting into the soil. And if you have an active biological community, those nutrients will be taken up and captured more effectively than if you're taking manure from a feedlot. So carbon sequestration by farming using regenerative agriculture. As I said, I think it's the most cost-effective, scalable, and proven way to move CO2 into the soil. Doesn't require more, new technology, more land, or a lot of energy. But I think the other thing that we need to be helping society understand is it also has collateral benefits. If you're increasing the carbon in the soil, you're basically increasing soil organic matter, which increases and improves soil aggregation, which improves water infiltration. And what that means is you get more water going into the soil, less of it running off, less erosion, less capping and sealing of the soil surface. And so it means if you're getting an awful lot of rain, you're capturing most of it, which for farmers creates some flood resilience, but it also then creates drought resilience, because if more water is getting into the soil, there's more water there if you do get into a drought situation, and more water is being held up in the soil and on the soil organic matter. But I think another really important aspect of that is if at a watershed scale, you start to have regenerative agriculture being practiced, what that is likely to mean is that you're going to have less severe flooding downstream, and you're going to need less municipal flood control infrastructure. You're going to suffer less damage in floods if the water is going into the farmland in the watershed rather than running off and being rushed off, either because it's running off or being tile drained off. The tile drainage enthusiasm, it drives me crazy. Because we need to be figuring out ways to keep the water on our farms and in our land. And we need to do that by improving our soil, not by putting plastic tile closer and closer as we make the soil more and more compact and less permeable to the movement of water. Another aspect of regenerative agriculture and a more balanced approach to plant nutrition is improved nutrient density in the food, which has both animal health and human health benefits, reduced use of the energy-intensive pesticides and fertilizers, and increased biodiversity, certainly below ground. If you're improving your soil's biology, you're increasing the diversity and the variety of fungi and bacteria and nematodes and a whole range of soil organic organisms. But also, often as people make the transition to a more regenerative agriculture, they're looking at greater diversity in their crop rotations, greater diversity in the type of hay and pasture crops they're growing, and also making more space for other plants and animals in the ecosystem. So these are all, I think, collateral benefits of an approach to regenerative agriculture. So for me, we've got a climate solution and a climate crisis, but the climate solution is under our noses and under our feet. Every time we take a bite, every time we drink, every time we breathe, we are interacting with the environment. And what we breathe, drink, and eat, and part of it becomes us. So we aren't, we've had this idea that we're separate from the environment, we're above and beyond the environment. No, the environment is us and we are the environment. So every time we take that bite, are we supporting a regenerative agriculture that's helping solve some of these really big problems? Or are we contributing to carbon loading in the atmosphere and the degradation of our resource bases? So that's a question that I try and, remember to pose to people, and particularly customers, try to help them understand that if they're supporting regenerative agriculture, they're helping to deal with some of the bad news that they hear daily on the radio or television. So I want to share a story back from the early 1980s. As I mentioned, we survived the energy crisis of the 1970s, and in the early 1980s, farmers, were starting to think about renewable energy, and the dean of the Agricultural College in Ontario, Clay Switzer, convened a meeting to discuss it. And so somehow I got invited. I was no big researcher or anything. I was a farmer, but somehow somebody got me invited. So we sat around this table and we discussed ethanol and biodiesel and methane. And then I said that I had a renewable energy engine, and it ran on fuel that I could harvest and grow and process on my own farm with the equipment I already had. That its waste products from its combustion were a beneficial soil amendment and fertilizer. And that it was a modular power source, and that I could couple the units together to use just the amount of energy that I needed, the amount of power required, and that I could actually produce these units on the farm. The technology was simple enough, and that I'd manufactured several that I'd already sold to other farmers, and that I was doing much of my farm work with these units, and that they could be voice activated. And it was really interesting. Everybody's really, on the edge of their chairs. They're really fascinated. This was pretty exciting. And then penny dropped for Clay Switzer, and he said, "You're talking about workhorses." And I said, "Yes." And they all laughed and went back to ethanol, biodiesel, and methane. That was over 40 years ago now. And I would bet that at that time, workhorses provided more work on Ontario farms than the three, ethanol, methane, and biodiesel combined. And I suspect that's still the case, because we have a fairly large Mennonite and Amish communities in the area, as well as some farmers who, like myself, thought outside the box. But nobody's doing that research, and nobody's done research on what new equipment with good bearings might do to improve the efficiency of horse-run equipment. Though the Amish and Mennonites have started manufacturing new equipment to replace the old manure spreaders and mowers and stuff that are really getting to the point of being older than I am, so are getting harder and harder to repair. So just some quick slides. Fuel we could grow and produce ourselves, fertility, modular units, technology that we could produce on the farm. And since '76, we've raised over 52 colts, some of which we've retained to replace older horses that were retiring and that we were selling, but most were sold as part of our livestock operation. We've had 3 tractors in that time. And none of them ever had a baby tractor. They've contributed to climate change as well as all the associated costs. So we were already doing a lot of our work with the units, and if I may be able to get this to go, here I'm feeding hay along a fence line on our winter pasture. And if you'll notice, the lines are just draped on the front of the sleigh. I'm standing up there, and my grandson, 10-year-old grandson, took this. So we'll see if it'll play. So I tell him to stop, and then I fork off. And when I tell them to go, they walk on again until I tell them to stop. So, you know, that's pretty handy. I haven't found a tractor that you could do that with. Oop. So, oop, ah. So, you know, there are a lot of benefits, I think, with horses. One of the surprises to me was I think they led to reduced compaction, because you aren't creating, if the soil's a little wet, you aren't creating a set of dams of compacted line under the drive wheels of your tractor. They have a bunch of different things. One of the other fringe benefits I discovered is they do have to rest on occasion, which meant I could too. In my early years of farming, I was working for neighbors in exchange for equipment, and I'd work all day at their farm, and then I'd work into the night using their equipment on my farm. And about a week into the spring planting, I'd been breathing dust and diesel fumes and getting a little enough sleep that I'd come down with a nasty cold. I happen to think smaller farms and more neighbors may be a benefit. And certainly their company in the field, pretty affordable. And so those are some benefits. And then there's some other benefits. What? So a couple of benefits at the bottom there. COVID has perhaps made us more aware of the challenge of long, complex supply chains, but certainly a tractor is not something I'm going to build on the farm. And the petroleum, the diesel fuel that we do use in our tractor, because we do have a tractor, involves a very long, complex supply chain. And I recommend the film Deepwater Horizon if you want to look at one aspect of the fossil fuel industry, which was the blowout of the oil well in the Gulf of Mexico. But the movie, you know, to me highlighted the real incredible complexity of that process. So we've got a really short supply chain for repair parts and new equipment. In our experience, horses are remarkably self-repairing, and we're in the good fortunate position that we have an Amish neighbor who does harness. I see I'm zooming through time here. So what did we lose? A whole bunch of things. And I think in some ways we lost a climate friendlier future and some independence and some sense of control. So regenerative agriculture comes in all sizes, and we need many different types because we need to have diversity. We have different contexts and environments, different markets, different approaches. So, you know, you can have a regenerative 1 acre farm and you can have a regenerative 5,000 acre ranch or a 50,000 hectare ranch. So we need diversity and complexity in our systems here. So, you know, here's some larger fields with various kinds of multi cover crops and intercropping between corn and that, you know, multi-species cover cropping. Here's some pictures from ecological farmer stuff, experimenting with, you know, garden stuff, prairie stuff. This is from the Ontario Soil Network. And that where tends to be some larger farmers in Ontario, planting green, experimenting with different aspects of keeping living roots in the soil. And here are the resources that I mentioned. And if you want to look at them, you can come back to it on the video, or you can just do it. There's some good stuff coming up on the MAKE thing. And there was the Manitoba Forage and Grass Association's conference the last couple of days. So there's a lot going on where you can get actual information. But the last thing I wanted to share with you is this graphic from Stephen Covey. And I found it very helpful because there's a lot to be worried about. There's a lot to be concerned about. And Covey's point was for most of us, our circle of concern is bigger than our circle of influence. Unfortunately, Donald Trump's circle of concern is much smaller than his circle of influence, because I think he's a pretty self-centered character. But anyway, that's just my bias. But for most of us, the places where we have an impact, where we influence other people, where we are effective at things, is smaller than the things that we might be worried about. But Covey's point is that if we spend most of our time worrying about our circle of concern, our circle of influence will shrink. Whereas if we spend our time working in our circle of influence, it will expand out and reach out into our circle of concern. So I want to close there with Joni Mitchell's thing, because in her last chorus in Woodstock, she says, "We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon. We are golden, caught in the devil's bargain, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden." And I think our detour into an industrial revolution fueled by fossil fuels may well have gotten us into a devil's bargain, where it seems great now, but I think we're in trouble as I know we're in trouble as I look at just shifting weather patterns, even on our own farm, and the experience of drought and that I would never have expected being 20 kilometers inland, halfway up the coast of Lake Huron. So as I close and I stop sharing here, I want to encourage you that as you go about your work in agriculture and food systems, that when you work in your circle of influence, I hope you'll consider ways to promote regenerative agriculture. To me, one of the low-hanging fruits for addressing climate change, improving farm resilience, and overall ecological health. So I think we've got time for some questions, Nazim. So
yes, thank you, Tony. This was really illuminating, lots of food for thought, if you like. And I particularly appreciated some of the more philosophical approaches you were bringing to the table. It's rare we hear those things laid out the way you have, and I loved your visual. So there was a question on making sure that presentation is shared, and we'll do that. I guess I'll start the conversation off. I don't see any questions at the moment, and I encourage everybody to make sure that they type that into the Q&A or even into the chat line so we can access them. But you mentioned soil health as a critical feature of regenerative agriculture, right? And we have quite a few soil scientists on the call today, and it's an important aspect to think about the One Health approach. Healthy soils go to healthy plants and animals, and then healthy food and healthy humans. And in that continuum, it all starts on land, right? So maybe you want to expand on that a little bit, whether that's from your own experience or from the associations you're part of. What can we do better there? Go ahead.
Well, when we bought our farm, and I couldn't afford a good farm, I was a young person in that. So I bought a farm that was fairly hilly, Canada Agricultural Class 4, had been cash cropped for over 15 years with no manure or pasture or hay. It was eroded. In fact, the neighbors told us that the reason the person who'd been working it planted the corn rows up and down the hill was so that they could drive up the ruts or the gullies and not across the gullies when they harvested it. So we were starting with a pretty poor soil. First year when I plowed it, seagulls wouldn't follow me because there weren't any earthworms being turned up in the soil profile. And so we learned about trying to rebuild soil organic matter and soil health, and moved to a rotation that was a 7-year rotation that had forage in 5 of those years. And so I think that the things we could be doing better is for people who are cash cropping to look at ways to increase the amount of time that they're harvesting sunlight. I've never understood this enthusiasm for roundupping your fields. As a farmer, I see myself as somebody who harvests sunlight and uses green plants to convert sunlight into substance, and then feeds that substance either into my farm business as livestock or food to sell, or into my soil to enrich and further improve my soil. So creating crop rotations for cash croppers that look at how to get maybe a multi-species green manure crop planted in conjunction with the crop that they're hoping to harvest and sell, and perhaps stuff that will winter kill, so that if they're putting it in the fall, it can winter kill and become a digestible mulch for the next crop, so they don't have to spray it, or if it's something that they're putting on in the spring, other ways to terminate it. But trying to keep something living and growing as long as you've got sunlight and temperatures that'll let you grow. And that's to me part of the beauty of including some permanent perennial forages in the system. And that's what we've now tended to go to, because they armor the soil, they keep living roots in the system. And then if you're pasturing, there's livestock. The other place we could, I think, do a better job is looking at how to get animals out of confinement and out onto the land. And that's where, if you're looking at multi-species cover crops, livestock love them. We're not a big cash crop thing, but I've experimented with them when we were doing the market garden and had areas that we didn't need for the market garden that year that we'd worked up, planting them to a multi-species cover crop. And two months later, we had stuff that was 2.5, 3 feet tall, thick as could be. The only thing that really didn't like that kind of group effort was corn. Maize does not like that kind of competition, but it was amazing how other stuff grew, and including small seeded legumes colonized the understory, and then when we grazed it off, they could come on. So there are lots of things to experiment with, and that will build soil in ways that we're really starting to learn more about. Anyway, that may be too long an answer, and I see there's some more questions in the Q&A, so let's.
We have a couple. We might as well read them out right away. Michelle poses a couple. First one on breeds of horses. The question is, are there breeds of horses that are suited to different types of farm work? Is there a resource for the genetic diversity of workhorses? Do you have a comment on that, Tony?
My experience, I've worked with 3 different breeds: Belgians, Fjords, and Suffolks. If you're getting started in horses, get an experienced old team is a lot more important than getting a fancy breed. But that's a long discussion. Some breeds like the Suffolk have tended to be kept as a farm horse. The Belgians and the Clydes and some of the perch runs have tended to be bred more for show now. In fact, the reason we switched from the Belgians to the Suffolks was that the stallions in our area were getting taller and taller, and it was getting harder and harder for me, and my daughter's shorter. So we went to the Fjords, felt they weren't quite heavy enough given our hills. They made up with momentum what they lacked in mass, but on our hills it made it hard for them to hold loads. So if you want to email me, Heather, I'd be glad to have a further discussion with you on this. But if people are getting started in horses, there are some very good resources around. And the NFU did a NF University session on working live draft animal power. And if you research that, you'll get 4 different people talking about that. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah,
next.
No problem. We'll move on to the next one. Again, Michelle might be able to get some more detailed information from you directly. There's a second question on the grass-fed dairy industry in Ontario. Can you give us an insight on the status of that?
I'm not the right person to talk about the grass-fed dairy. Bill Vaness is someone I know, but I haven't really spoken to him about it. But he's a dairy farmer who's really worked at pasturing and is working on creating a savory hub, a holistic management savory hub, information hub, I believe. But I know very little about grass-fed dairying in Ontario. What I've read about it, but not necessarily for Ontario, is people who are looking to do that tend to look to be more seasonal, and either produce processing milk, or set up a small cheese business, that sort of thing, so that they can time their production to match their grass production. And that's part of how do we create systems that are low cost? And that is by going with natural rhythms as opposed to fighting natural rhythms. And also as farmers, being focused on our net income rather than our gross income as a way of measuring success and our actual productivity. Anyway, see, there are more questions coming in, so I will try not to be too long-winded.
Okay, we'll go through them as they come in. Joanne asks, what do you think about food labels for regenerative products? For example, we get organic label in the US, whether it's livestock or plants.
I'm very mixed on that, because I think you don't want people cheating. And what I got started on looking to develop the organic labeling process in Ontario back in the 80s, when I called down to the University of Guelph and said we had an organic speaker coming up to the ecological farmers and would they like him to stop in. And the professor I got said, "Oh, organic, you just label it." And I thought, well, I hope you're not teaching agricultural ethics. But I'm also concerned that often in labeling, we end up going to the sort of lowest common denominator and not encouraging the creative exploration as we create a rigid sort of, this is what you got to do and this is the minimum you've got to do. I have not been happy with how organic certification has turned out. We're still certified organic. We helped start the system in Ontario, but it hasn't encouraged the kind of dynamic creativity and learning from each other that I hoped it would, and has also then created a situation where you have people looking for loopholes. So I'm very mixed. I kind of like regenerative being a bit loosey-goosey, and let's see how it keeps evolving. But next question.
Yeah, so Ellery asked about transitioning from the kind of the cash crop farming into something that is more regenerative. I guess the challenges of getting industrial quote unquote farming to change, which is quite unlikely. How would that happen?
I think it's quite likely. I think as supply chains crash, you run out, fertilizer's not manufactured, or the cost of it goes up because now it's actually paying the true externalized cost of fossil fuels. I think you might find that it's going to crash. But then I've thought that for quite a while, so maybe I'm way out to lunch. But you're in a very vulnerable system because you're very input dependent, and you may be an economic crisis because it's not a system designed to benefit farmers, as that net farm income, gross farm income line does. And when you fall below that line and are starting to face bankruptcy, you may decide that some changes are in order. But the good news is, when we made the transition to organic, we went cold turkey with very little information on how to rebuild our soil, how to do that. Boy, if you were cash cropping now and you were wanting to do this, you'd take one, look at your rotation, figure out which field to start with, figure out how to put in a multi-species cover crop that will really address the soil issues that particular field's dealing with, and then just start moving it through. And there are a whole bunch of collateral benefits to farmers when you start working with natural systems in terms of pest control, in terms of disease control. Maybe you're going to go to some smaller fields so that you don't just create a smorgasbord for the disease and a smorgasbord for the pests with no habitat for beneficial stuff. So, there's a lot out there on how to make the transition. And if you go to some of the websites, Understanding Agriculture, there are resources there, and certainly the various things. So there's a lot of possibility there. I don't think it's oh God, I'm going to cut my throat if I transition. I'm going to be an economic disaster. It wasn't for us, and we didn't have the information that's available now.
Great, thanks. And we have a question from a graduate student who's working on a vertical farm system in a First Nations community in northern Manitoba. And the student asks what the difference, advantages, disadvantages will be to hydroponic versus soil cultivation type systems in these containerized or vertical farm systems. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, I see hydroponic as being pretty divorced from being connected to the ecosystem, to being something where beneficial soil microorganisms, beneficial predatory and parasitic insects, and so I'm not personally a big fan of hydroponics as the solution, but certainly if you're trying to grow food in a remote location, limited resources, it may be an excellent way. And again, that's why I say, diversity, a whole range of options. No, it's not a system that I get excited about, but I could be in a very, if I were up north with an Inuit community with the lighting, the LED lights can provide light energy with a much lower electrical input cost than the old incandescents did. So there may well be places where this makes a lot of sense. Certainly maybe makes a lot more sense than flying in lettuce grown in California. So, good luck with it. But think about your energy balance. That's the thing that really has underpinned my concern about how we do agriculture, is if we're putting more energy in than we're getting out, maybe you're better figuring out how to go back to hunting seals and eating, what's in their stomachs. That's a system that they used to have. Why are we trying to feed them a diet? Anyway.
No, you're making very good points. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I just looked at the clock, and time flies when you're having a fun. But Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. It was very inspiring talk, and hopefully our audience enjoyed it just as much as I did, and can maybe access your links through this talk and connect with you separately to discuss this further.
And if people have questions, you're welcome to email them to me as well. I am a busy person and a busy farmer, so I may not get them all answered tonight or in super detail, but I'll do my best. Well, I'm afraid I keep seeing more going into the question. Okay, they're in the chat. Okay, good.
In the chat room, people are chatting, which is a great sign. Well, Tony, thanks again, and thanks to the audience for joining us today. Please keep an eye on future events through makemanitoba.ca and our websites. And as I mentioned before, this particular presentation will certainly be featured there, and we'll share the link widely. Thanks, everybody, and have a great evening. Thanks, Tony.
Take care, all. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.